She wasn't supposed to bleed on the throne. That wasn't part of the ceremony. Wasn't written in the ancient texts that governed how trembling human girls were presented to the vampire lord who'd rejected every bride for 3 centuries. But when the iron rose carved into the armrest caught her palm, splitting skin like silk under a blade, everything changed. The scent of her blood hit the air, and Vex Nocturnalis, the king who hadn't moved for anyone in living memory, went absolutely still. The kind of stillness that comes before lightning strikes. What Mira didn't know, kneeling in her own blood on the steps of his obsidian throne, was that she carried something in her veins that hadn't existed in this world for 1,000 years, and the cold, untouchable vampire lord, watching her from his seat of bones in midnight, would burn the kingdom to ash before he let her leave. The great hall stretched toward heaven, like a cathedral, built by nightmares. Black marble columns rose 50 feet high, carved with scenes of conquest and blood. Chandeliers dripped with crystals that caught the moonlight streaming through stained glass windows, each one depicting a different death, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Mira's bare feet whispered against the stone floor as the temple priestess pushed her forward. She was the 43rd girl this month, alone, the 1,000th since Lord Vex Nocturnalis had opened his gates and announced he sought a bride. Every noble family in the 5 kingdoms had sent their daughters, dripping in jewels and desperation, each one convinced she'd be the one to thaw the frozen lord's heart. He'd rejected them all without a word, sent them home before they'd finished stating their names. But Mira wasn't a noble's daughter, wrapped in silk and ambition. She was the orphaned child of a bloodletter, raised in the temple infirmary where the sick came to die, and occasionally, if the gods were merciful, to heal. She knew the weight of a scalpel in her hand, the precise pressure needed to open a vein without hitting the artery beneath. She'd held more hands through death than most people held through life. And she absolutely did not want to be here. The priestess had chosen her 3 days ago, appearing in the infirmary doorway like a specter in white robes. "Your blood is pure," she'd said, as if that explained why Mira's life was being offered up to a creature who drank human lives like wine. The temple had raised her, fed her, given her purpose. When they demanded payment, what choice did she have? So now she walked toward the throne where Lord Vex Nocturnalis waited, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that she'd likely be rejected before sunset and returned to the temple in disgrace, assuming he returned her at all. The vampire lord sat motionless on his throne of blackened iron and ancient bone, a figure carved from winter itself. He wore armor even here in his own hall, black plate traced with silver that caught the light like frost on midnight water. His hair fell past his shoulders, white as fresh snow, stark against skin that had forgotten the touch of sun centuries ago. But it was his eyes that made Mira's steps falter. Empty, not cruel or cold or bored, just empty, like looking into wells that had run dry so long ago that even the memory of water had faded. She'd seen that look before, in the infirmary, in patients who'd lost too much blood, who'd crossed the threshold where the body stops fighting and simply waits for the end. He looked dead, more dead than the corpses she'd prepared for burial, because at least those bodies had been alive once, had held warmth and laughter and dreams. This creature on the throne looked like he'd never known any of those things. The priestess jabbed her forward with sharp fingers. Mira stumbled on the first step leading up to the throne platform, catching herself on the armrest. The iron rose carved into the ancient metal was sharper than it looked. Pain sliced across her palm, bright and sudden. Blood welled up, deep red against her pale skin, and dripped onto the step. 1 drop. 2. 3 perfect spheres of crimson sliding down black marble. The hall went silent. Every vampire in attendance, every guard lining the walls, every courtier pretending disinterest, they all stopped breathing. Mira didn't understand why until she looked up and saw Lord Vex Nocturnalis, staring at her hand with an expression she couldn't name. His nostrils flared. His fingers, resting loose on the throne's arms, suddenly gripped the metal so hard it groaned, and his eyes, those terrible empty eyes, flickered with something that looked almost like hunger. Not the hunger of a predator for prey, but the desperate hunger of a man dying of thirst who just glimpsed water, real water. Not the mirage he'd been chasing through desert sands for lifetimes. "Stop the bleeding," a voice commanded from somewhere to her right. A thin vampire in scholar's robes rushed forward with bandages, his movements sharp with urgency that bordered on panic. "Cover the wound immediately." But Vex raised one hand, a gesture so slight it barely qualified as movement. And every person in the hall froze. "No." His voice cut through the space like a blade through silk, quiet but absolute. "Let me see." Mira's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't know what was happening, didn't understand the tension crackling through the air like lightning about to strike. But every instinct screamed that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple bride selection. The vampire lord rose from his throne for the first time in anyone's memory, unfolding to his full height. He moved down the steps toward her, each footfall deliberate and measured, a predator's grace wrapped in a king's authority. He stopped one pace away, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his armor, the faint scars on his jaw that spoke of battles fought when the world was young. "Your name," he said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Mira," she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again with more strength. "Mira Thorn, my lord, from the temple infirmary." He didn't seem to hear the second part. His attention remained fixed on her bleeding palm, watching each drop fall with the intensity of a man watching the last stars fade before an endless dawn. The scholar vampire edged closer, his hands twisted together. "My lord, perhaps we should allow the temple priestess to tend the wound. This is highly irregular. The girl wasn't prepared for bloodletting. Everything about this is irregular." Vex replied without looking away from Mira's hand. "She bleeds on sacred ground, on the throne itself. Do you know how long it's been since human blood touched these stones?" The scholar swallowed. 300 years, my lord, since the curse." "Since the curse," Vex repeated softly, and something in his voice made Mira's skin prickle. He finally lifted his gaze to her face, and she saw it clearly now, that flicker of hunger mixed with something that looked almost like pain. "Tell me, Mira Thorn from the temple infirmary, what do you know of vampire physiology?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, trying to shift mental gears from terrified bride to the girl who'd spent 15 years learning the secrets of blood and bone. "I know that you require human blood to survive, but that you can subsist on animal blood for extended periods. I know that your heart beats only once per hour when unfed, faster when you've drunk recently. I know that silver burns your skin but doesn't kill you, and that sunlight is painful but not instantly fatal if you're old enough." Vex's expression shifted, just slightly, from empty to something that might have been surprise in a creature capable of such an emotion. "You learned this in a temple infirmary?" "My master was a bloodletter before she took holy vows," Mira said. "She believed knowledge was sacred, that understanding the body, any body, was a form of prayer. She taught me everything she knew before the fever took her." "And what did she teach you about vampire curses?" "Nothing," Mira admitted. "I didn't know vampires could be cursed. Everything can be cursed," a new voice said from the shadows beside the throne. A girl stepped into the light, no more than 14, with the same white hair as Vex, but eyes that held warmth his lacked. Everything with a heart can be broken, and everything broken can be cursed to stay that way. "This is my sister," Vex said, and for the first time Mira heard something almost soft in his voice. "Lyra Nocturnalis, the youngest of our bloodline, and the reason I've rejected 1,000 brides." Lyra moved with the careful grace of the chronically ill, each step measured to conserve energy. She wore a simple black dress that hung loose on her thin frame, and her skin held a translucence that came from too many days without proper feeding. But her eyes were alive in a way her brothers weren't, bright with curiosity and something that looked like hope. "You smell different," Lyra said, stopping a few feet from Mira. "Not like the other girls. They all smelled like perfume and ambition and fear. You smell like medicine and old books and," she inhaled deeply, "compassion." "That's not a smell," Vex said, but his tone held no real reproach. "Isn't it?" Lyra tilted her head, studying Mira with unnerving intensity. "I think it is. I think some people carry it in their blood, the willingness to heal rather than harm." Mira didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just watched the interaction between brother and sister with the careful attention she'd learned in the infirmary, the kind of observation that caught details others missed, the subtle signs that told the real story beneath the surface. Vex loved his sister. It was written in the way he angled his body toward her, ready to catch her if she fell, in the way his empty eyes tracked her movements with laser focus, in the tension that lined his shoulders whenever she took a breath that came too shallow. He loved her, and he was terrified of losing her. The scholar cleared his throat again. "My lord, if I may. The human's blood, it carries the scent, the one we've been searching for." "I know," Vex said quietly. "Why do you think I haven't sent her away?" Mira's pulse kicked up. "What scent? What are you talking about?" Lyra smiled, and it transformed her face from pale and tired to something luminous. "You carry the cure in your veins, Mira Thorn. The thing my brother has been hunting for 3 centuries. The reason he's rejected every bride who walked through those doors. They came offering beauty and status and strategic alliances. But all he ever wanted was someone who could save me." The words didn't make sense. Mira looked at her still bleeding palm, at the drops of blood that had caused such a reaction, and tried to understand. "I'm just a bloodletter's apprentice. There's nothing special about me." "Nothing special about your blood?" The scholar actually laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Girl, your blood carries antibodies we haven't seen since the old world fell, since before the curse that killed half the vampire population and left the other half." He gestured to Lyra, susceptible to the wasting sickness. "You're a universal cure, walking and breathing and completely unaware of your own value." Mira's knees felt weak. She'd known her blood type was rare, O negative, the universal donor. But this was something else entirely. This was being told she was a living miracle, and she had no idea how to process that information. "Show her," Vex said to Lyra. "Show her why you need this. Why I need this." Lyra rolled up her sleeve with practiced ease, revealing arms covered in bruises that bloomed purple and black against white skin. She healed slowly, Vex explained, his voice carefully controlled. A scratch that would close in seconds for a normal vampire takes weeks for her. Her blood doesn't clot properly, doesn't carry oxygen efficiently, doesn't fight infection. Every day, she fades a little more, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. He tried everything, the scholar added quietly. Every healer, every scholar, every dark ritual. We've searched for 300 years, Vex continued, and Mira heard the exhaustion buried beneath his controlled tone. Ever since the curse took our parents and half our people, leaving the survivors to watch their children waste away. Every vampire born after the curse carries the sickness to some degree. Lyra has it worst of all. She's dying, and I've been powerless to save her. Until now, Lyra said, looking at Mira's bleeding palm with naked longing. Until you walked in and bled on sacred ground, and your blood sang to us like a song we'd forgotten we knew. Mira's mind raced, trying to absorb this impossible information. Her blood was a cure. Her presence here wasn't about marriage or alliance or any of the political games she'd assumed. It was about survival, about a brother desperate enough to reject 1,000 brides because none of them could save his dying sister. I don't understand, Mira said slowly. If you knew you needed someone with specific blood, why the bride ceremony? Why not just test everyone in the kingdom? We tried, the scholar said. We've tested hundreds of thousands. No one carried the markers. We thought perhaps they'd died out entirely, been lost when the old world fell. The bride ceremony was, his mouth twisted, the High Council's idea. They said if Lord Vex was going to obsess over saving one dying girl, he should at least choose a wife in the process. Solidify alliances, produce an heir, all the things kings are supposed to do. I rejected their candidates, Vex said flatly, because I don't need a decorative wife. I need a miracle. And miracles don't come wrapped in silk with political agendas. They come bleeding on throne steps, smelling of temple incense, and carrying secrets in their veins. Mira looked at her palm again, watching her blood drip onto the black marble. Each drop seemed impossibly important now, weighted with meaning she'd never imagined. She thought about Lyra's bruised arms, about Vex's empty eyes, about 3 centuries of searching and desperate hope. I'll help, she heard herself say. If my blood can save her, I'll give it freely. You don't have to marry me or play games or pretend this is anything other than what it is. Just tell me what you need. The hall went silent again, but this time it felt different, not tense and dangerous, but shocked, almost reverent. Vex stared at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. You would give your blood, he said slowly, without negotiation, without demands, without even knowing if the process will harm you? Mira shrugged, suddenly aware that every vampire in the hall was listening to her words with an intensity that bordered on hunger. In the infirmary, we took oaths to heal where we can, to ease suffering where we can't heal, to never turn away someone in pain. Your sister is in pain. Why would I turn away? Something shifted in Vex's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a crack in the ice that had frozen his features for longer than Mira had been alive. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Not just the blood in her veins, but the person who carried it. You would make a terrible bride, he said, and there might have been the ghost of amusement in his voice. Completely unsuitable for court politics. Far too honest, too direct, too willing to give without taking. I know, Mira said. That's why I never expected you to choose me. I'm not choosing you as a bride, Vex replied. I'm choosing you as hope. There's a difference. He turned to the scholar. Prepare the ritual chamber. Full medical attendance. I want every precaution taken. And send word to the High Council that the bride selection is over. We found what we were looking for. The scholar bowed and hurried away, already barking orders at servants who scattered like startled birds. Lyra moved closer to Mira, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she said quietly. You don't know what this means. I think I'm starting to, Mira replied, and surprised herself by meaning it. She looked at Vex, at the way he stood between her and his sister, protective even now, and understood something fundamental about the cold vampire lord who'd rejected 1,000 brides. He wasn't cold. He was careful, wasn't cruel, was terrified. Every decision he'd made for 3 centuries had been about protecting the one person he loved, and he'd wrapped himself in ice to survive the fear of losing her. The priestess who'd brought Mira stepped forward, her face pinched with disapproval. "Lord Vex, surely you don't intend to proceed with this common girl. The ceremony requires—" "I don't care what the ceremony requires." Vex cut her off, his voice dropping to a tone that could freeze oceans. "This woman offered her blood freely to save a stranger. That makes her worth more than every decorated noble who walked through these doors combined. The priestess will escort you back to the temple and help you gather your belongings. You'll be staying in the palace." Mira's stomach dropped. Staying? For how long? Vex looked at her with those empty eyes that suddenly didn't seem quite so empty anymore. However long it takes. The treatment isn't a single session. Lyra will need regular transfusions, possibly for months, possibly for years, until her body learns to produce the antibodies naturally. If it ever does. So you'll stay. In comfort, with every resource at your disposal, doing exactly what you've trained your whole life to do. Heal someone who desperately needs it. It wasn't a request. Wasn't really a demand either, just a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who'd learned long ago that the universe bent to his will. Mira should have been frightened, should have argued, negotiated, demanded guarantees for her safety. Instead, she looked at Lyra's hopeful face, at Vex's carefully controlled desperation, and nodded. The ritual chamber existed deep beneath the palace, carved from living stone and lined with silver. Moonlight filtered through crystal shafts in the ceiling, painting everything in shades of blue and white. Medical equipment filled wooden tables, some recognizable from the temple infirmary, others strange and ancient, designed for bodies that didn't quite follow human rules. Mira stood in the center of the room, acutely aware that she'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. 2 hours ago, she'd been a temple orphan with no family and no future, beyond stitching wounds and changing bandages. Now she stood in a vampire's medical chamber, preparing to give her blood to save a dying girl she'd just met. The scholar, who'd introduced himself as Corvus, bustled around her with nervous energy. He'd laid out instruments with surgical precision, crystal vials and silver needles and leather straps that made Mira's stomach clench. "This isn't like the bloodletting you're familiar with," Corvus explained, adjusting his spectacles. "We need to extract enough to make a difference, but not so much that you're compromised. Your body will produce more, of course, but the initial drain will be significant." "How significant?" Mira asked, proud that her voice remained steady. Corvus glanced at Vex, who stood motionless by the door, watching everything with predatory focus. 2 pints, maybe 3. Enough that you'll feel weak afterward, lightheaded. We'll keep you under observation, provide iron supplements, nutrient-rich foods. But there is risk. There's always risk. Mira had assisted with enough bloodlettings to know the truth of that. She'd seen patients who tolerated the procedure beautifully, and others who'd crashed halfway through, their bodies rebelling against the loss. She thought about turning back, about demanding they return her to the temple, but then Lyra entered the chamber, and the choice became simple. The young vampire moved slowly, supported by a nurse whose face carried the deep patience of someone who'd been providing that support for years. Lyra wore a thin white shift that made her look even more fragile, like a ghost of herself, but her eyes found Mira's and held them with fierce gratitude. "I'm ready," Mira said. "Tell me what to do." The procedure took 2 hours. Mira lay on a padded table, while Corvus worked with the careful precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, each movement practiced and deliberate. The needle hurt less than she'd expected. A sharp pinch followed by dull pressure. She watched her blood flow through clear tubes into crystal containers, dark red against sterile glass. It looked ordinary. She'd seen blood every day for years, had learned to read its color and consistency like text, diagnosing anemia or infection or clotting disorders from a single drop. Her own blood looked unremarkable, nothing that suggested it carried miracles in its composition. Vex stood beside her the entire time, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his body like winter air. He didn't speak, didn't touch her, just watched with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. There was something almost protective in his stillness, as if his presence alone could shield her from harm. Lyra sat across the room, prepared for the transfusion. 2 nurses flanked her, monitoring her pulse and breathing, ready to intervene if her body rejected the foreign blood. Corvus had explained the risks in clinical detail, how vampire physiology sometimes reacted violently to human blood, especially blood this potent. They might have minutes before they knew if it would work, or if Lyra's body would tear itself apart fighting the cure. "You don't have to watch," Vex said quietly, the first words he'd spoken since they'd entered the chamber. "If this goes wrong, if he stopped, jaw tightening. You don't have to see it." "I want to," Mira replied. "She deserves to have someone watch. Who cares whether she survives? You don't even know her." "I know she's 14 and dying," Mira said. "I know she has a brother who's spent 3 centuries searching for a way to save her. I know she smiled at me when she had every reason to be bitter about her life. That's enough." Something flickered across Vex's face, too quick to catch. He turned back to watching Lyra, but his hand moved, just slightly, until it rested on the table beside Mira's. Not touching, but close. Close enough that she could feel the cold emanating from his skin. When Corvus finished extracting the blood, he moved immediately to Lyra. The transfusion began with the same careful precision, vampire nurses monitoring every reaction, ready to stop if her body showed signs of rejection. Mira watched, lightheaded and weak but unable to look away, as her blood entered Lyra's veins. For a long moment, nothing happened. Lyra lay still, eyes closed, breathing shallow. The nurses exchanged worried glances. Corvus checked his instruments twice, then 3 times, his face drawn with tension. Vex's hand, resting beside Mira's, curled into a fist so tight his knuckles went white. Then Lyra gasped. Her eyes flew open, wide and shocked. Her back arched off the table, muscles seizing, and for one terrible moment, Mira thought they'd killed her, thought her blood had poisoned rather than cured, and she'd have to live with that knowledge forever. But then, Lyra's breathing steadied, deepened. Color bloomed in her cheeks, faint but real, like the first blush of dawn after an endless night. Her eyes, which had been dull with illness, suddenly blazed with life. The bruises on her arms, those terrible purple shadows that had marked her skin like a map of suffering, began to fade. Not disappearing completely, but lightening, shrinking, healing at a rate that defied natural law. "I can feel it," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I can feel my heart beating properly, feel my blood moving like it's supposed to. Oh gods, I'd forgotten what this felt like." The nurses erupted in controlled chaos, checking vitals, recording observations, their professional calm cracking to reveal genuine amazement. Corvus stared at his instruments like they'd betrayed him, then at Lyra, then back at the instruments, trying to reconcile what his measurements told him with what his eyes could see. Vex moved. One moment he stood frozen beside Mira's table. The next he was across the room, dropping to his knees beside his sister. He grabbed her hand with shaking fingers, pressing it to his forehead like a prayer. "Lyra," he breathed, and his voice cracked on her name. "Can you does it?" "I'm not dying," Lyra said, and laughed, high and bright. "For the first time in my entire life, I'm not dying." She threw her arms around her brother's neck, and Vex caught her, held her like she was made of spun glass and starlight. His shoulders shook. Mira realized, with a sharp twist in her chest, that he was crying. Silent, restrained, probably the first tears he'd shed in centuries, but crying nonetheless. She looked away, giving them privacy for a moment that felt too intimate for strangers to witness. But Corvus approached her table, blocking her view, his face transformed by a smile that took years off his ancient features. "It worked," he said, almost laughing. "By all the old gods and new, it actually worked. We theorized, we hoped, but to see it, he shook his head. You've just changed history, girl. Changed the fate of our entire species." Mira tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The room spun, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. Corvus caught her shoulder, easing her back down. "Easy. You've lost a significant amount of blood. You'll need rest, fluids, time to recover. But you'll be fine. You'll be." He stopped, searching for words. "You'll be celebrated, honored, probably worshipped by half the vampire population once word spreads." "I don't want worship," Mira said, pressing a hand to her swimming head. "I just want to make sure she stays healthy." "That might take years," Corvus said seriously. "The antibodies will help her body heal, but we don't know if the effect is permanent. She may need regular transfusions for the rest of her life." "Are you prepared for that? To be bound to this place, to this family, possibly forever?" Mira thought about the temple, about her small room and her quiet life, stitching wounds and brewing medicines, about the friends she'd left behind, the routines she'd known. Then she looked at Lyra, who was talking animatedly to her brother, her hands moving in excited gestures, her face alive in a way that spoke of second chances and stolen time returned. Forever felt less like a prison and more like a purpose. "Yes," Mira said, "I'm prepared." The next 3 days passed in a blur of medical observation and cautious celebration. Mira remained in the palace infirmary, sleeping 12 hours at a stretch, waking to find trays of rich food beside her bed, and Corvus hovering like an anxious mother hen. Lyra visited every day, growing stronger each time, the transformation almost miraculous. Her skin lost that translucent quality, gaining warmth and resilience. Her movements became fluid rather than careful. Her laugh, which Mira learned came easily and often, filled the infirmary with brightness that stone and shadow had forgotten. Vex came too, though less frequently and always silently. He'd enter the infirmary at odd hours, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure he had permission to come closer. Watching Mira with an expression she couldn't decipher. On the third night, Mira woke to find him sitting beside her bed, motionless in the darkness. She should have been startled, maybe frightened, but instead felt oddly comforted by his presence. "You don't have to guard me," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." "I'm not guarding you," Vex replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to understand you." "Understand what?" "Why you did it. Why you offered your blood without negotiation, without knowing if it would even work. Why you're still here, recovering slowly, when you could demand anything from me and I'd give it. You could ask for gold, for titles, for your own kingdom. Why do you ask for nothing?" Mira considered the question, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. "In the infirmary, we had a saying, the best healers don't treat bodies, they treat pain. And pain doesn't negotiate. It just needs someone to acknowledge it exists." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I saw your pain. Hers. Offering to help wasn't strategic. It was just the only response that made sense. Vex was quiet for a long moment. Then his hand moved, reaching toward hers where it lay on the blanket. He stopped short of touching, fingers hovering in the space between them. "May I?" he asked. Mira's heart kicked up, but she nodded. His hand closed over hers, cool skin against warm. His touch carried the chill of deep winter, but not unpleasantly. Like cool water on feverish skin, shocking and soothing simultaneously. His fingers, long and elegant, and marked with scars that spoke of battles fought across centuries, wrapped around her smaller hand with unexpected gentleness. "I have not touched another person with kindness in 300 years, Vex said quietly, staring at their joined hands as if they belonged to strangers. "Have not allowed myself softness or hope or any emotion that might distract from my purpose. Lyra was all that mattered. Saving her was the only thought I permitted myself. Everything else was noise. And now?" Mira asked. "Now I find myself sitting in the dark, beside a human woman who gave everything without asking why, and I don't know what to do with the gratitude that threatens to consume me." His thumb traced the back of her hand, the gesture almost unconscious. "You've given me back my sister. Given her a future I'd stopped believing existed. How do I repay a debt like that?" "You don't," Mira said simply. "Debts are for transactions. This wasn't a transaction. It was just the right thing to do." Vex looked up, meeting her eyes in the darkness. His gaze, which had been so empty in the throne room, now held something bright and fierce and almost frightening in its intensity. "You are either the kindest person I've ever met, or the most naive. Perhaps both." "I'm a realist," Mira corrected. "I know exactly what I am and what I'm not. I'm not brave or special, or anything exceptional. I'm just someone who recognizes suffering when she sees it and has the ability to ease it. That makes you exceptional, in ways you don't understand." Vex's hand tightened on hers, just slightly. Most people, even those who claim compassion, help only when it benefits them. When they can leverage kindness for social capital or divine favor or simple self-satisfaction. You helped because your heart wouldn't allow you to do otherwise. That's not naivety. That's strength most people never achieve. Mira didn't know what to say to that, so she simply held his hand and let the silence stretch between them, comfortable and warm, despite the cold of his touch. After a while, Vex spoke again, his voice carrying a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "Tell me about your life, before the temple, before all this." "There's not much to tell," Mira said. "My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both within days of each other. The temple took me in, gave me purpose, taught me the bloodletter's trade. It was a good life. Lonely, but good." "Lonely," Vex repeated, as if the word held special meaning. "Yes, I understand lonely." His thumb continued its slow path across her knuckles, a gesture that seemed to comfort him as much as her. "I've been lonely for 3 centuries, surrounded by thousands and completely alone. Do you know what that's like, to have power and wealth and armies at your command, and not one person who sees you as anything other than a means to an end?" "I think everyone knows that feeling," Mira said, softly, to some degree. The loneliness of being seen, but not known. Valued, but not loved. Vex's expression shifted, something ancient and painful moving behind his eyes. "You say that with certainty. Were you loved before your parents died?" Mira smiled, the memory bittersweet, but not cruel, fiercely. "My mother used to say I was her miracle, her gift from gods, who usually demanded more than they gave. My father called me his little healer, even before I understood what healing meant." She paused, swallowing past the sudden tightness in her throat. They loved me completely and without condition. I think that's why I can give freely now. They taught me that love isn't a transaction, that giving doesn't require receiving. You had 3 good years then? Vex asked. With parents who loved you? I had 3 perfect years. Then I had 15 years learning to honor that gift by helping others feel even a fraction of what they gave me. Not everyone who loses love becomes bitter. Some of us become grateful for having had it at all. Vex stared at her like she'd spoken a truth that rewrote his understanding of the world. His hand trembled slightly where it held hers. You shame me, he said quietly. I've lived 1,000 years and understood less about the nature of love than you learned in 3. Not shame, Mira corrected gently. Maybe just a different perspective. You spent centuries protecting love, keeping your sister alive against impossible odds. That's not nothing, Vex. That's everything. Protection isn't the same as connection, Vex said. I kept Lyra alive, but I didn't. He stopped, jaw tightening. I didn't laugh with her, didn't share joy or play games or any of the things siblings should do. I was so focused on preventing her death that I forgot to help her live. The weight of self-recrimination in his voice made Mira's chest ache. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. You did what you could, with what you knew. And now you have the chance to do more. To be more than her protector. The words hung in the darkness between them, weighted with possibility. Vex studied their joined hands, his expression complex and unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rough edge that might have been emotion breaking through centuries of ice. Teach me. Please. Teach you what? How to be human again. How to feel things besides fear and desperation. How to, he gestured helplessly with his free hand, exist as something other than a weapon protecting one precious thing. Mira felt the responsibility of that request settle over her shoulders like a mantle. Teaching a vampire king how to be human proved more challenging than healing his sister. Lyra's recovery followed predictable patterns, her body responding to Mira's blood with steady, measurable improvement. But Vex's emotional resurrection resisted easy categorization. He approached connection like a military campaign, demanding schedules and strategies and concrete steps he could master through sheer force of will. It doesn't work like that, Mira explained on the 5th morning, watching him sit rigidly across from her in the infirmary's garden courtyard. Emotions aren't enemies to be defeated or territories to be conquered. They're just part of being alive. Then tell me the steps, Vex insisted, his frustration evident in the tight line of his jaw. Give me a methodology I can follow. A structure. There are no steps. You just have to be willing to feel. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Vex looked at her like she'd suggested he walk into sunlight without armor. I've spent 3 centuries avoiding hurt. Building walls specifically designed to keep feeling at a safe distance. You're asking me to dismantle those walls with no guarantee of what happens after. I'm asking you to trust that what happens after is worth the risk, Mira said. She reached across the small table between them, offering her hand palm up an invitation. Start small. Tell me something true, something you've never said out loud. Vex stared at her hand like it might bite. For a long moment, Mira thought he'd refuse, retreat back into the ice that had protected him for so long. Then he placed his hand in hers, cool fingers wrapping around her warmth. I'm terrified, he said quietly. Every moment of every day. The fear never stops, never eases, just sits in my chest like a stone I swallowed centuries ago. I'm terrified Lyra will relapse. Terrified your blood will stop working. Terrified I'll lose her anyway despite everything. And beneath that, quieter but somehow worse, I'm terrified of hope. because hope means having something to lose. Mira squeezed his hand, acknowledging the courage it took to voice those fears. That's human, she said gently. That's what feeling alive looks like. It's messy and uncomfortable, and sometimes overwhelming, but it's also beautiful. It's also exhausting, Vex countered, but something in his expression had softened. How do humans bear it? How do you wake each day knowing everything you love could be taken away? We find reasons to get up anyway, Mira said. We hold on to moments of joy even when they're fleeting. We love fiercely precisely because time is limited. And we support each other through the hard parts. Their daily sessions became ritual. Each morning, Mira would take Vex to different parts of the palace and teach him to notice beauty he'd stopped seeing. The way sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting rainbow patterns on stone floors. The sound of servants laughing in the kitchen. The smell of bread baking, of rain on summer-warmed earth, of Lyra's perfume when she swept past on her way to lessons. Small things, easily overlooked, that added up to something like contentment. Lyra joined them whenever her energy permitted, delighting in seeing her brother slowly thaw. She had a gift for drawing out his buried humanity, teasing smiles from lips that had forgotten how to curve upward, coaxing laughter from a chest that had held only ice for longer than she'd been alive. Together, they created something Mira hadn't expected, a family knitting itself together from broken pieces and borrowed time. But the palace watched with less benevolent eyes. Word of Mira's healing abilities spread through the vampire courts like wildfire, and with it came a tension that made her deeply uncomfortable. Nobles she'd never met appeared at the infirmary, requesting audiences, offering gifts, hinting broadly that their children or parents or siblings suffered similar ailments, and would she, perhaps, consider extending her generosity? Corvus turned them away with scientific precision, explaining that Mira's blood worked specifically for Lyra's condition, that attempting transfusions without proper testing risked killing both donor and recipient. But the requests kept coming, growing more desperate, more demanding. The High Council summoned Vex on the 7th day. Mira wasn't invited to the meeting, but she heard about it from Lyra, who'd eavesdropped with the casual skill of someone who'd spent a lifetime being underestimated. They want to study her, Lyra reported, pacing the infirmary with agitation that spoke of improved health. Want to run experiments, see if they can replicate her blood's properties. Create a cure that doesn't require keeping one human woman locked in the palace, as if she's a problem to be solved rather than a person who saved my life. What did your brother say? Mira asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. He told them that you're under his protection and they'll approach you over his corpse. Lyra smiled, fierce and proud. Then he threatened to raise the council chambers if they bothered you again. It was very dramatic, very him. Relief and concern warred in Mira's chest. She appreciated Vex's protection, but understood the political cost of defying the council. I don't want to cause problems, she said. If there's a way to help others safely, maybe we should consider it. The research began carefully, with Mira's explicit consent and Corvus's obsessive oversight. They took small samples of her blood, studying its composition with instruments both scientific and mystical, trying to understand what made it so potent. The results baffled even the eldest scholars. Your blood carries markers from the old world, Corvus explained, showing Mira charts covered in symbols she didn't understand. Genetic sequences that haven't existed in the human population since before the curse. It's as if your lineage somehow preserved antibodies to a disease that wouldn't emerge for another 1,000 years. How is that possible? Mira asked, staring at her own blood under Corvus's enchanted microscope. It looked the same as always, just red cells and plasma. Nothing that suggested miracle or mystery? We don't know, Corvus admitted. Perhaps your ancestors survived the curse's initial outbreak and developed immunity. Perhaps it's simple genetic lottery, the right combination of random factors producing exactly what we needed, exactly when we needed it. Or perhaps, he adjusted his spectacles, there's something divine at work, the gods paying an old debt. Mira didn't believe in divine intervention, but she couldn't deny the strangeness of her situation. What mattered was the result, Lyra's continued improvement. The hope spreading through vampire communities that a cure might be possible. What mattered less, but still nagged at her late at night, was the question of what happened when she was no longer unique. When they'd synthesized her blood's properties and could cure anyone without needing her, would she go back to the temple? Return to her quiet life of stitching wounds and brewing medicines? The thought should have brought relief, but instead left her feeling hollow. Vex found her in the garden on the 9th night, sitting beneath stars that painted the sky in shades of silver and midnight blue. He developed a habit of seeking her out when sleep eluded him, which seemed to be increasingly often. "You're thinking too loudly," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I can hear the worry from across the courtyard." "Can vampires actually hear thoughts?" Mira asked, momentarily distracted. "Or is that just a comforting lie you tell yourselves to seem more intimidating?" Vex's lips twitched, almost a smile. No telepathy, unfortunately. "But I've learned to read your expressions. Right now you're wearing the same look you get when you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't have a good solution." Mira sighed, leaning back against the cool stone. "I was thinking about what happens next. When Corvus figures out how to replicate my blood's properties, and I'm no longer necessary. Whether I go back to being just another orphan with nowhere to belong." "You belong here," Vex said immediately, with an intensity that startled her. "Not because we need your blood, though we're grateful for it. Because you've become part of this place. Part of us." His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "Lyra loves you. Corvus adores you. The servants fight over who gets to bring your meals because you actually thank them and remember their names. You've made yourself essential through kindness, not biology." "And you?" Mira asked quietly. "What do I mean to you?" Vex was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. When he finally spoke, his voice carried vulnerability she'd learned to recognize as his truth. "You make me want to be alive again. Not just existing, not just protecting, but actually living, feeling joy and pain and all the complicated mess between them. You've reminded me that there's more to existence than duty and fear." He turned to face her, his eyes catching the starlight. "I don't know what to call that. Don't know if there's a word for someone who teaches you to be human again. But whatever it is, that's what you are to me." Mira's heart stuttered in her chest. She'd felt the connection growing between them, those quiet moments in the dark, the way his touch had become comfort rather than curiosity. But hearing him voice it made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. "I'm just a healer," she said, though the words felt inadequate. "You're everything," Vex corrected. "And I think I'm falling in love with you, though I barely remember what love feels like. It's terrifying and exhilarating, and I have no idea what I'm doing." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest and impossibly brave from a man who'd spent centuries hiding behind ice. Mira should have been cautious, should have remembered all the reasons why falling for a vampire king was complicated and dangerous. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. His lips were cool against hers, tasting of night air and winter storms. For a heartbeat he froze, shocked. Then his hand came up to cup her face with gentleness that contradicted his strength. The kiss deepened, slow and exploratory, two people learning each other through touch. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder than necessary, Vex rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want you to leave," he whispered. "Not when the cure is synthesized. Not ever. I want you here, in this palace, in my life. Teaching me to feel, helping Lyra grow strong, just existing beside me. But I won't trap you, won't use my power or your compassion to keep you somewhere you don't want to be. Tell me what you want." Mira thought about the temple, about cold stone floors and quiet days, about the life she'd known before bleeding on a throne changed everything. Then she thought about Lyra's laughter echoing through corridors, about Corvus's excited explanations of blood chemistry, about Vex's hand in hers, and the way he looked at her like she held the secrets to every question he'd ever asked. "I want to stay," she said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her bones. "Not because I'm needed, but because this feels like home. More home than the temple ever did. Because you've given me a family I didn't know I was missing." Vex's expression transformed, ice melting completely to reveal the warmth beneath. He pulled her close, wrapping her in arms that held the strength of centuries and the gentleness of new love. They sat together under stars that had witnessed 1,000 years of history, writing a new chapter in their light. The next morning, Lyra found them asleep on the garden bench, Mira's head on Vex's shoulder, their hands still entwined. She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen this coming since the moment Mira had offered her blood without hesitation. Later, when they'd woken and returned inside, Lyra cornered Mira in the infirmary. "You love him," she stated, not quite a question. Mira felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I think I might. Is that terrible? Terrible?" Lyra laughed, bright and genuine. "It's perfect. You've already saved my life. Might as well save his, too. He needs you more than I do, honestly. All the blood transfusions in the world won't help if he goes back to being that frozen thing on the throne. You've melted him. Made him human again." "I didn't do anything special," Mira protested. "Yes, you did," Lyra said seriously. "You saw him, not the king, not the vampire lord, not the protective brother. Just him. Vex. The person underneath all that armor and ice. That's the most special thing anyone's done for him in 1,000 years." The words settled over Mira like a benediction. She'd spent her whole life helping people see their wounds so she could heal them. She'd never considered that sometimes the greatest healing came from being seen in return. The spring festival arrived 3 weeks after Mira's blood had first touched Lyra's veins. The palace transformed into something magical. Courtyards filled with flowers that bloomed in defiance of the early season. Musicians playing songs that spoke of renewal and hope. Vampires and humans mingling with cautious optimism that felt like the beginning of something new. Vex had declared it a celebration of life, officially honoring his sister's recovery, but privately celebrating something more complex. A kingdom learning to heal, a culture beginning to transform, a vampire lord remembering how to love. Myra stood in her chambers, staring at the gown the palace seamstresses had created for her. Deep blue silk that caught the light like water under moonlight, embroidered with silver stars that scattered across the fabric in constellations she almost recognized. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever worn. "You look like starlight made flesh," Lyra said from the doorway. She wore white and gold, her cheeks flushed with health that still seemed miraculous, her eyes bright with mischief. "Are you ready for your debut?" "My debut?" Mira turned, confused. "I'm just attending the festival. You're being formally presented to court," Lyra corrected, grinning. As the woman who saved my life. As Vex's, she paused delicately, very close companion. As the healer who changed our future. People will want to see you, thank you. Probably try to worship you a little. Try not to let it go to your head. Panic fluttered in Mira's chest. I'm not good with crowds, or worship, or any kind of public attention. I'm just a healer. Just a healer who revolutionized vampire medicine and captured a king's heart, Lyra said. But don't worry, Vex will be beside you the whole time. He's very good at the scary protective thing. You'll be fine. The festival courtyard blazed with light and life. Torches lined the walls, their flames dancing in the evening breeze. Tables overflowed with food, both human and vampire, a symbol of the integration Vex hoped to foster. Music filled the air, joyful and complex, played by musicians who'd learned to blend human and vampire instruments into something entirely new. Mira entered on Vex's arm, acutely aware of every eye turning toward them. Conversation didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. The king looked different tonight, she realized. He'd abandoned his armor for formal robes of midnight blue that matched her dress, though she suspected that was Lyra's doing. His white hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp angles of his face, and his eyes held warmth that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. He looked alive, happy, human in all the ways that mattered. They made their way through the crowd, Vex introducing her to nobles and scholars and common folk alike. Each person thanked her with varying degrees of formality, some with tears in their eyes, others with gifts pressed into her hands despite her protests. A mother approached holding a small child, vampire pale, but with warm eyes that spoke of recent recovery. My daughter was dying, the woman said, her voice breaking. The same wasting sickness that took so many of our children. But the cure, the one they synthesized from your blood, it saved her life. She wanted to thank you herself. The little girl, no more than 5, stepped forward with the grave seriousness of children everywhere. She held out a flower, purple and delicate, clutched in her small fist. Thank you for sharing, she said carefully. Mama says sharing is how we show love. Mira's throat tightened. She knelt down to the child's level, accepting the flower with hands that trembled slightly. You're very welcome. And your mama is right. Sharing is exactly how we show love. The child smiled and threw her arms around Mira's neck in a spontaneous hug that nearly broke her composure entirely. When she pulled away and returned to her mother, Mira stood to find Vex watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter. What? She asked quietly. Just remembering why I fell in love with you, he replied. You kneel for children. Give them the same respect you'd give a king. That's rare. That's precious. The festival continued with speeches and toasts. Lyra standing before the crowd to tell the story of her healing with eloquence that brought tears to eyes that had forgotten how to cry. She spoke of darkness and desperation, of a brother who'd never stopped fighting, of a healer who'd given everything with an open heart. But the most powerful moment came when Vex himself took the platform. The crowd fell silent instantly, vampire and human alike waiting to hear what their king would say. For 300 years, Vex began, his voice carrying across the courtyard with effortless authority, I have ruled with one purpose. Protect my sister. Save the people I love. I built walls around my heart because I believed emotion was weakness, connection was distraction, and love was a luxury I couldn't afford. He paused, his eyes finding Mira in the crowd. Then a woman bled on my throne and taught me that I was wrong about everything. She didn't save Lyra with superior strength or ancient magic or any of the things I'd spent centuries seeking. She saved her with compassion, with the simple willingness to help someone in pain. And in doing so, she saved me too. Mira felt heat flood her face as every eye turned toward her. Vex continued, his voice gentler now. I announce tonight that Mira Thorne is under the Crown's permanent protection. Any who threaten her, harm her, or attempt to exploit her generosity will answer directly to me. But more than that, he stepped down from the platform, walking toward her through the parted crowd. I ask her, before all of you as witnesses, if she will consent to stay. Not as my subject or my healer, but as my partner. My equal, the person who reminds me daily that strength comes in many forms, and the greatest strength is the courage to remain kind in a world that rewards cruelty. Mira's breath caught. This wasn't quite a proposal, not in the traditional sense, but it was a declaration, a public claiming that bound them together in the eyes of every vampire in attendance. She could refuse, could step back, protect herself from the complication of loving someone who lived in centuries while she counted in decades. But looking at Vex, at the vulnerability in his eyes, at the life they'd begun building together, the choice felt simple. Yes, she said clearly, I'll stay. The crowd erupted in applause and cheering, the sound washing over them like a wave. Vex pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers in the gesture that had become theirs. Thank you, he whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear. For everything, for staying, for loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. Mira kissed him, soft and certain, uncaring that half the kingdom watched. When they pulled apart, Lyra had somehow appeared beside them, pulling them both into an embrace that turned into a tangle of laughter and joy. The rest of the festival blurred into music and dancing and celebration. Mira found herself swept into conversations with scholars who wanted to discuss blood composition, with healers eager to learn new techniques, with children who'd been saved by the cure synthesized from her contribution. She met Vex's council members, vampires ancient and powerful, who looked at her with respect rather than dismissal. Saw the way the kingdom was changing, slowly but surely, old prejudices giving way to possibility. As midnight approached, Vex and Mira slipped away from the celebration, seeking quiet in the garden where they'd first confessed their feelings. The stars blazed overhead, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful nonetheless. Do you regret it? Vex asked, pulling her close against the night chill. Agreeing to stay? Agreeing to love someone who will outlive you by centuries? Mira leaned into his embrace, feeling his cool skin against her warmth. I regret nothing. You've given me purpose, family, love. That's more than most people get in a lifetime. It's enough. It won't always be easy, Vex warned. There will be challenges, political complications, people who resent our connection or fear the changes we represent. I know. Mira tilted her head back to look at him. But we'll face them together. That's what partnership means. The seasons turned, carrying them forward into a future neither had imagined possible. Mira's work expanded beyond Lyra's care to establishing healing centers throughout the kingdom, training both human and vampire healers in techniques that bridged their different physiologies. The cure synthesized from her blood became widely available, saving countless lives and transforming vampire culture in ways that rippled through generations. Lyra bloomed into a force of nature, her recovered health channeled into scholarship and diplomacy. She became the bridge between vampire and human communities, using her own experience with suffering to advocate for those the kingdom had overlooked. Watching her thrive, Mira understood why Vex had fought so desperately to save her. She wasn't just a sister. She was hope made flesh, proof that the future could be better than the past. Vex himself changed most dramatically. The cold, untouchable lord who'd rejected 1,000 brides learned to laugh freely, to show affection without restraint, to govern with compassion rather than fear. He and Mira built something unprecedented, a partnership that balanced power with tenderness, strength with vulnerability. They established new laws protecting humans in vampire territories, created councils where both species had equal voice, slowly dismantled the hierarchies that had divided their world for millennia. Not everyone approved. There were factions who resented the changes, who clung to old ways and old prejudices. But Vex handled opposition with the same fierce protectiveness he'd once reserved for his sister, making it clear that attacking Mira or her work meant declaring war on the crown itself. Gradually, resistance faded into grudging acceptance, then cautious participation. 5 years after Mira had bled on the throne, the kingdom celebrated the first joint council, vampires and humans governing together as equals. Vex stood before the assembled representatives, Mira beside him, Lyra on his other side, and spoke of progress and possibility. His words carried hope rather than command, invitation rather than decree. Watching him, Mira marveled at the transformation. This was the man who'd been dying inside, frozen by fear and duty, now blazing with life and purpose. She'd saved Lyra with her blood, but they'd saved each other with something more powerful, with the willingness to be vulnerable, to trust, to love despite the fear. That night, alone in their chambers, Vex pulled Mira close. "We should talk about the future," he said quietly. "About what happens when you age, and I don't. When time claims you, and leaves me behind." Mira had thought about this. Of course, it was impossible not to consider the mathematics of loving someone functionally immortal when you were decidedly mortal. "We live the time we have," she said simply. "We fill it with meaning and love and purpose. And when my time ends, you'll grieve and heal and continue the work we started. That's not tragedy, Vex. That's life. I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The thought of existing without you, of going back to that frozen half-life, I can't bear it." "Then don't," Mira said. "Don't freeze when I'm gone. Stay warm. Stay connected. Love Lyra's children, if she has them. Mentor the healers we've trained. Keep building the world we dreamed of together. That's how you honor what we have, by living fully even after I can't anymore." Vex buried his face in her hair, holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "You make death sound like an acceptable outcome. I make death sound like what it is. The natural end to a life, fully lived. We don't get to choose how long we have. Only what we do with the time we're given." She pulled back to look at him, cupping his face in her hands. "And I choose to fill every moment I have with you, with this life we're building, with purpose and joy and love that transforms kingdoms. That's enough. That's everything." They stood together as stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time that would eventually separate them. But for now, in this moment, they had each other, had the family they'd created, the kingdom they were healing, the love that had thawed centuries of ice. Mira thought about the terrified girl who'd bled on a throne 5 years ago, certain she'd be executed for her clumsiness. She could never have imagined this future, standing in a vampire king's arms, having transformed not just one life, but thousands. Having found home and purpose and love in the last place she'd expected. The cold vampire lord who'd rejected 1,000 brides had chosen her not for her blood or her beauty or her status, but for her heart. For the compassion that defined her, the kindness that cost her nothing and gave everything. And in choosing her, he'd chosen to be human again. To feel and love and hope despite the fear. Their story became legend, told and retold through the generations that followed. The healer who'd saved a kingdom with her blood and her king with her love. The vampire lord who'd learned that the greatest power wasn't the strength to destroy, but the courage to remain gentle, and the young vampire girl who'd survived impossible odds to become a bridge between worlds. But the truth, Mira knew, was simpler than legend allowed. It was just two broken people finding each other in the dark. Just compassion meeting need and creating something beautiful from pain. Just love, in all its messy, complicated, transformative glory. The bleeding on the throne hadn't awakened Vex's hunger for blood. It had awakened his hunger for life, for connection, for all the things he'd denied himself in the name of protection. And Mira, the orphan healer with nothing but her skills and her heart, had given him permission to want those things again. To believe that surviving wasn't the same as living, and that the risk of pain was worth the reward of joy. They lived fully in the time they had. Vampire and human. King and healer. Two souls who'd found each other against impossible odds and refused to let fear define their story. And when Mira's time finally came, decades later, she died surrounded by the family she'd chosen, the kingdom she'd helped transform, and the vampire who'd loved her with a fierceness that would echo through eternity. Vex kept his promise. He didn't freeze. Instead, he carried her warmth forward, building the world they'd dreamed of, loving fiercely the people she'd cared for, staying human in all the ways that mattered. And sometimes, in quiet moments, he'd sit in the garden where they'd first confessed their love and remember. Remember the woman who'd bled on his throne and taught him that the greatest magic wasn't blood or power or immortality. It was compassion. Courage. The simple willingness to help someone in pain. That was the legacy Mira left behind. Not the cure in her veins, but the reminder that healing came in many forms, and sometimes the broken needed saving just as much as the dying. The cold vampire lord had rejected 1,000 brides because none of them understood what he truly needed. Then came a healer who looked at his empty eyes and saw not a monster, but a man who'd forgotten how to hope. And with her blood, her love, and her unwavering kindness, she'd reminded him what it meant to be alive.